Have you ever looked up at the starlit sky and thought how amazing the universe is? Maybe you've even wondered how all of this got here. How did everything begin? So let's take a logical look at the story of our origins to see if we can come up with answers to those questions. We'll start by logically analysing the story that has been thrust upon society for over 150 years. This is the naturalistic or atheistic view of origins and how this all came to be. In the beginning, there was nothing. No space, no matter, no time, literally nothing. Then, somehow, random quantum fluctuations caused an initial singularity to explode. From this explosion, all matter, space and time came into existence. Over time, the conditions for life on Earth became right for the first life to appear. Somehow, non-living chemicals came together in just the right way to allow this non-living material to spontaneously generate into the first living organism. Over time, this first living organism changed and developed into more complex organisms. These organisms grew in complexity and over time became all that we see on Earth today. They became all animal life as well as plant life, climaxing with the development of humans. This is a simplified version of the story that has been told to people for more than 150 years. Very little has changed since the time of Darwin. The story still says that life came about from nothing, with no intelligent mind behind it, and has become all that we see and observe today. Now, does this story match with what we observe, and is it logical? Let's start with the first premise of this story, that the universe, all space, time, and matter came into existence from nothing. It had to be nothing. If there is no intelligent mind behind the existence of what we see, then the universe had to come from nothing. However, is this even logical? When have you ever seen something come from nothing? When those who tell this story say that this is how it happened, how do they know? They were not there. In fact, no one was there. Not only was there no one there to observe this, there is absolutely no evidence to support that the universe popped into existence out of nothing. Now, if as some say, it was not nothing, but it was an initial singularity, where did this initial singularity come from? You must answer that question. If there was something, something had to cause it. This is well known and is called the law of cause and effect. There has never been an effect observed that did not have a cause. Now, let's assume that somehow the impossible happened and that nothing was able to cause the universe to come into existence out of nothing. How did the first living organism come into existence from non-living chemicals? This has never been observed. Never have non-living chemicals been observed to create life, even in its most simple form. So to state that this happened with the first life form is totally illogical. No one was there to observe it, and there is no evidence to support it, both in history and with observational evidence. In fact, the statistical chances of just the simplest life form to have developed by chance with no intelligence behind it shows that it's impossible. If the statistical chances for the first organism to form by chance are impossible, then the chances for this life form to gradually become something as complex as a human is even crazy to discuss. Let's assume that somehow non-living chemicals were able to spontaneously generate from non-living material. How then did this first life, which has no purpose or intelligence behind it, decide to become more complex? The first life would have no brain, no intelligence to guide it. So then how would it know to become more complex? How did it decide to take on the form that it did? How did this first life even survive? How did this first life know how to reproduce, and where did this ability come from? While not as complex as other types of organisms, the type of cell that evolutionists propose to be the first life is still complex. How did this complexity come about from non-intelligence? The advent of the first living organism is another story that has no witness to verify whether this is true. No one was there, and again, there is no evidence to support that this happened. Okay, let's assume over time that the first living organism was able to gradually become more complex. How did this life form overcome the law of entropy? To become more complex, this would mean that additional information needs to be added to create the changes needed to form other organisms. Where did this information come from? How and why did these organisms decide to form DNA? How did these organisms come up with the language found in DNA, since there was no intelligence behind the process? When and how did these life forms decide to become organs and then systems? How and why did these life forms decide, with no brain and no intelligent guidance, to become food that had seeds inside to reproduce and then create other life forms that would eat this same food? How did these organisms, which were not being guided by intelligence and had no mind themselves, create plants that take in carbon dioxide and give off oxygen, and then create creatures that breathe oxygen and give off carbon dioxide? This story says that this first life form, by itself, became more complex and actually became everything we currently see. Not only is this against all logic, but again, there was no one to observe this, and the evidence absolutely does not support this. Now, let's assume that life was able to come from non-living chemicals and get more complex. How and why did these organisms with no brain and no guidance from an outside intelligence decide to not only become plants and food, but to create other living organisms to actually eat this food? Why would these organisms do this, since they had no need to create this food for themselves? If they survived without the need to become an orange, then why did they become an orange? On top of that, these living organisms with no brain and no guidance from an outside intelligence were not only able to create this food, which has seeds inside to grow more, but they were also able to create mouths to eat this food. How did they know to create this food and then to create mouths needed to consume it? Since they had no purpose and no guidance outside of themselves, how and why did they do it? Let's say that these living organisms were able to not only decide to form different life forms, but then to create food that would support these life forms. How and why did they, without a brain and no guidance from an outside intelligence, develop intricate organs and systems to not only eat this food with a highly complex mouth, but then to digest this food, take in nutrients from this food, and develop all of the systems to make this all function? How did these organs and systems survive before they were put together to do what they were intended to do? How and why was there any intention to do anything, since this was unguided and had no mind behind it? Okay, let's say that non-living chemicals were able to spontaneously become a living organism, become more complex over time, become all living animals as well as the food these animals need to survive, and do this all with no brain and no guidance from an outside intelligence. How and why did these organisms develop sexual reproductive systems? How did these organisms, with no brain and no guidance from an outside intelligence, create completely opposite sexes in creatures, including humans? How and why did they create male and female with opposite body parts that work perfectly together to reproduce? Why would these organisms create reproductive systems at all, since asexual reproduction would have been an even better way to reproduce? How and why did mindless, unguided processes create the amazing human brain, which is more complex than any computer? How did a life form without a brain then design and create the amazing brain? How did the brain and all the intricate systems develop and survive before each system was functioning? If you look at the real evidence and think about it critically, you will see that this story does not add up. It takes a lot of faith to believe it. Now, let's look at another story. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God is outside of time and space, so He is the eternal, unchanging, uncreated cause. He is eternal and self-sustaining, existing above the laws of nature. God caused all matter, space, and time to come into existence, using His plans, purpose, and design. It was this intelligent designer who set the conditions so life could survive and thrive on Earth. This super-intelligent creator and engineer created all sea creatures, land animals, plant life, as well as humans that all reproduce after their own kind. He created plant life and food for his creatures to eat. This food had its seed in itself so it could reproduce and provide sustenance to every living creature he made. He then created humans in his own image, in his own likeness, and created them male and female. Now, you be the judge as to which story makes more sense in the world in which we live. It's quite clear when you look at the universe, Earth, and the complexity of life we see around us, that this story not only makes more logical sense, but it is supported by all the evidence we find and observe. This story is the one that fits with actual reality. If you're watching this and are a skeptic, or even an atheist, it's our hope that you will open your mind and take the time to truly look at the evidence. Once you do, we are confident that you will see that the tale spun by many so-called scientists is pure fantasy and nothing more. If you want to learn more about the lines of evidence that prove the biblical worldview, please visit linesofevidence.com.